Welcome to 365 Motivationals. Today, we're diving into a classic book on personal development, Dynamic Thought by William Walker Atkinson. Written in the early 20th century, this powerful book explores the principles of dynamic thought and the law of attraction, long before these concepts became popular. Atkinson, a pioneer in the field of positive thinking and practical psychology, guides us through techniques to awaken our inner potential, transform our mindset, and manifest our deepest desires. By combining philosophical teachings with practical advice, Dynamic Thought offers a roadmap for those seeking to improve their lives, achieve their goals, and embrace a mindset of success and prosperity. Get ready to discover inspiring ideas and proven strategies for cultivating dynamic thought. Stay with us as we explore the chapters of this extraordinary book and learn how you can apply these principles to your own life. Subscribe, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our daily motivational videos. Let's begin this journey together with Dynamic Thought by William Walker Atkinson. A foreword. This is a queer book. It is a marriage of the ancient occult teachings to the latest and most advanced conceptions of modern science, an odd union, for the parties thereto are of entirely different temperaments. The marriage might be expected to result disastrously, were it not for the fact that a connecting link has been found that gives them a bond of common interest. No two people may truly love each other, unless they also love something in common. The more they love in common, the greater will be their love for each other. And, let us trust that this will prove true in this marriage of occultism and science, celebrated in this book. The occultists usually get at the facts, first, but they manage to evolve such outrageous theories to explain the facts, that the world will have none of their wares, and turns to science for something reasonable. Science, proceeding along different lines, at first denies these facts of the occultists, not finding them accounted for by any of her existing theories, but, later on, when the facts have been finally thrust under her eyes, after repeated attempts and failures, she says, "Oh, yes, of course," and proceeds to evolve a new theory, welding it with other scientific hypotheses, and after attaching a new label thereto, she proudly exhibits the thing as the latest discovery of modern science and smiles indulgently, or indignantly, when the theory of the old occultists is mentioned, saying, "Quite a different thing, we assure you." And yet, in all justice, be it said, science usually proceeds to find much better proofs to fit the facts of occultism, than did the occultists themselves. The occultist sees things, but is a poor hand at proofs, while the scientist is great on proofs, but so often, and so long, fails to see many things patent to the occultist who is able to look within himself, but who is then unable to positively and scientifically prove the facts. This is easily explained. The occultist's information comes from within, while the scientist's comes from without, and proofs belong to the without side of mentation. And this is why the occultists so often make such a bungle regarding proofs and the scientist fails to see facts that are staring the occultist in the face. The whole history of occultism and science proves the above. Take the phenomenon called mesmerism for instance. It was an old story with the occultists, who had been for years aware of it, theoretically and practically. Mesmer brought it into general prominence, and science laughed at it and at Mesmer's fluid theory, and called him a charlatan and impostor. Years afterwards, Braid, an English surgeon, discovered that some of the facts of mesmerism were true, and he announced his discovery in a scientific manner, and lo! His views were accepted, and the thing was called hypnotism, poor old Mesmer being forgotten, because of his theory. Then, after a number of years, certain other aspects of the phenomenon were discovered, and scientifically relabeled suggestion, and the renaming was supposed to explain the entire subject. The learned ones now saying, "Pooh, 'tis nothing but suggestion," as if that explained the matter. But so far, they have only accepted certain phases of this form of dynamic thought, for that is what it is, and there are many other phases of which they do not dream. And the same is true of the occult teaching that there is life in everything, the universe is alive. For years, this idea was hooted at, and we had learned scientific one. Discourses upon dead matter, inert substance, etc. But, only within the past decade, yes, within the last 5 years, has science discovered that there was life in everything, and that even in the atom of mineral and chemical substance, there was to be found evidence of mind. And science is beginning to plume itself on its recent discovery, and to account for it by a new theory, which is quite a different thing, we assure you, from the old occult theory. And the same will prove true in the case of the occult teaching of an universal mind, or cosmic mind. Science and philosophy have long laughed at this, but even now their foremost investigators have come to the borders of a new country, and are gasping in amazement at what they see beyond its borders. They are now talking about life and mind in the ether, and before long they will discard their paradoxical, absurd, hypothetical ether, and say, we are bathed in an ocean of mind, only they will insist that this ocean of mind is, somehow, a secretion of matter, something oozing out from the pores of matter, perhaps. But science is doing valuable work in the direction of investigation and experiment, and in this way is proving the principal occult teachings in a way impossible to the occultists themselves. So, you see that both occultism and science have their own work to do, and neither can do the work of the other. Just now science is coquetting with the question of thought transmission, etc., at which she has for so long sneered and laughed. By and by she will accept the facts, and then proceed to prove them by a series of careful and conclusive experiments, and will then announce the result, solemnly, as a triumph of science. And so, in this book you will find a marriage of the old occult teachings and modern scientific research as an investigation. And the two are bound together with that bond forged by the writer of the book, heated in the oven of his mind, and hammered into shape with his untrained thought, a crude, clumsy thing, but it serves its purpose, a thing called the theory of dynamic thought. And so, this is what this theory is, a tie that binds. How you will like it depends upon yourself. For himself, the writer does not hesitate to say that he is pleased with his handiwork, rude, and clumsy though it may be. He believes that he has made a thing that will stand wear and tear, and that though it be not beautifully finished, it will serve, and be useful. And that is the main thing, after all. And, then, perhaps, some may see beauty in the very crudeness of the thing, may see that it bears the loving mark of the hammer that beat it into shape, may recognize that over it has passed the caress of the hand that made it, and in that seeing there may come the recognition of a beauty that is beyond prettiness. William Walker Atkinson. Los Angeles, California, February 16, 1906. 2. Chapter 1. In the Beginning. This book will deal with life. It holds that life is universal, that it is inherent in, and manifests, in different degrees, in every part, particle, phase, aspect, condition, place, or relationship, in the world of things that we call the universe. It holds that life manifests in two aspects or forms, which are generally found by us in connection and cooperation with each other, but which are both, probably, an expression of some one thing higher than either. These two aspects or forms, which together go to make up or produce that which we know as life, are known as 1. Substance or matter, and 2. Mind. In this book the term substance is used in preference to matter, owing to the fact that the term matter has become closely identified with certain ideas of the materialistic school of thought, and has generally been regarded by the public in the light of dead matter, whereas this book holds that all substance is alive. The term mind is used in the sense of mind, as we know it, rather than as mind, as it is or, as the cosmic mind. In some places the term mind principle is used to convey the idea of a portion of the great principle of mind, of which that which we call mind is but a small and but partially expressed portion. These terms are explained and illustrated as we proceed. The aspect of energy or force is not treated as a separate aspect or form of life, in this book, for the reason that it is regarded as merely a manifestation of mind, as will appear as we proceed. We have much to say regarding motion, but the writer has tried to explain and prove that, at the last, all motion results from mental action, and that all force and energy is vital mental force and energy. This book is not intended to run along metaphysical or theological lines, its field is different. And so, while it recognizes the importance of these branches of human thought, still, it finds that its own particular field is sufficient to engross its entire attention, for the moment, and, consequently the aforesaid subjects shall not be touched upon except incidentally, in connection with the subject matter of the book. This being the case, there will be no discussion of the origin of life, the question of creation, the problems of theology and metaphysics, the riddle of the why and wherefore of life and the universe. The writer has his own opinions upon these questions, but feels that this is not the place in which to air the same. For the purposes of the book, he prefers to leave every reader to his own favorite views and conceptions regarding these great subjects, feeling that the views regarding life, mind, motion, and substance, that are advanced in this book, may be accepted by any intelligent reader, without prejudice to his, or her, accepted religious or philosophical views. The writer sees that this something called life exists, he finds it in evidence everywhere. And he sees it always in its aspects of substance and mind. And he feels justified in regarding life as always existing in, and manifesting in these aspects, always in conjunction, at least, life as we know it. And he finds certain apparent laws of life in operation in the universe to which all life, in all of its aspects, is apparently amenable. And he feels justified in considering these laws constant, and invariable, and unchangeable so long as the universe, as it now is, exists. And with the above views in mind, this book will proceed to a consideration of its subject, without attempting to peer behind the veil separating the universe from its causer, life from its source. But in justice to reader, subject and writer, the latter has thought it well to state that he does recognize, not only the veil, but that which is behind the veil. To proceed without this statement would be unfair and misleading. The writer wishes to be understood positively upon this point, even though the declaration may bring forth the derisive jeer of those who feel that they have outgrown this conception, or else the calm, superior, pitying smile of those who feel that the universe is its own cause and effect. By universe, the writer means the whole body of things, Webster. His declaration means that he believes in that which is above things. The writer prefers not to attempt to define that which he calls the infinite. The word infinite means without limit in time, space, power, capacity, knowledge or excellence, Webster. And to define is to limit, mark the limits of, mark the end of, etc. The term define, as applied to the infinite, is ridiculous, an absurd paradox. The writer echoes Spinoza's statement, to define God is to deny him. And so there shall be no attempt at definition or limitation. But the human mind, in considering the subject, is bound by its own laws to think of the infinite as real, and actually being and existent, if it thinks of it at all. And if it thinks of it as infinite, it must, by its own laws, think of it as causeless, eternal, absolute, everywhere present, all-powerful, all-wise. The human mind is compelled to so consider the infinite, if it thinks of it at all. But even in so thinking of it as being these things, it is doing something like defining or limiting it, for the infinite must not only be those things, but it must be so much more, that those things are but as a grain of dust on the desert as compared to the real being of the infinite. For the things mentioned are but finite or defined things, things possessed by the finite things, and, at the best can be but symbols of the attributes or qualities of the infinite, even the words attributes or qualities being an absurdity as applied to the infinite. This view, also, must be reported by the human reason, if it thinks about the matter at all. The final report of the human reason regarding this matter is that it is insoluble and unthinkable to that reason, in its final analysis. This because the human reason is compelled to use terms, concepts, etc., derived from its experience with finite things, and therefore has no tools, measurements, or other appliances with which to think of the infinite. All that it can do is to report that it finds that it has limits itself, and that it finds beyond those limits that which it cannot define, but which it is justified in considering as infinite, and superior to all finite conceptions, such as time, space, causation, and thought. The idea of thought being finite, equally with time, space, and causation, is not common, but the writer is compelled to place it in that category, because it is clearly under the laws of time, space, and cause and effect, and must be considered as finite. The knowledge possessed by the infinite must be something far transcending that which we know as the result of mental operations, or thinking. Certain fundamental truths seem to have been impressed upon the human intellect, and the reason is compelled to report in accordance therewith. But an analysis of these fundamental truths is futile, and the attempt only leads one into wild speculations. The only advantage that comes from the attempt is the strengthening of mental muscle of those who are able to stand the strain of the exercise, and the fact that by such attempt we are made aware that we do not know, and cannot know, by reasons of the nature of the intellect, and are thus prevented from harboring absurd and childish theories about the unknowable. To know that we do not know, and cannot know, is the next best thing to actually knowing. The writer does not wish to be understood, that the limits of the human reason are unalterably fixed. On the contrary, he believes that additional fundamental portions of truth are superimposed upon the mind of the race from time to time. And he believes, yes, knows, that there are regions of the mind that give reports higher than those conveyed through the intellect. And he believes that there are phases of knowledge in store for man that will raise him as much higher than his present position, as that present position is superior to that of the earthworm. And he believes that there are beings in existence today, on planes of life as yet undreamed of by the average man, who far transcend man in power, wisdom and nature. He believes that man is merely just entering into his kingdom, and does not realize the grandeur of that which is his divine inheritance. It will be as well to mention here that the classification of mind with the aspects of life, in conjunction with substance, and motion, does not mean that the ego or man is a material thing. The writer believes that the ego is a transcendent being, partaking in some wonderful way of the essence of the infinite, that it is a soul, immortal. He believes that as Paul says, we are all children of God, but what we shall be does not as yet appear. These matters shall not be discussed in this book, but the writer wishes to make himself clear, in order to prevent misunderstanding. Again, in this respect, he must fly in the face of materialism. But, although the writer expresses his belief in the existence of the infinite, and bases his philosophy upon that basis, he does not wish to insist upon the identification of his conception with that of any other particular conception of the source of life. Nor does he insist upon names, or terms, in connection with the conception. He has used the term, the infinite, because it seems to be broader than any other of which he could think, but he uses it merely as a name for the unnameable. So, if the reader prefers, he, or she, may use the terms, God, deity, first cause, principle, unknowable, infinite and eternal energy, the thing in itself, the absolute, or any of the other countless terms used by man in his attempt to name the unnameable, to describe the undescribable, to define the undefinable, and all may retain their ideas, or lack of ideas, regarding the relation of the infinite to their own particular religious views, or lack of views. The philosophy of this book need not disturb a man's religious belief, nor does it insist upon the man holding any special religious belief. Those are matters entirely for the exercise of the man's own reason and conscience. And they may retain their own pet philosophy regarding the origin, purposes or plan of the production and existence of the universe. This book shall not meddle with their metaphysics or philosophy. What is herein offered may be assimilated with the fundamental ideas of nearly every form of religious or philosophical belief, it being in the nature of an addition rather than a subtraction, or division. Its philosophy is constructive rather than destructive. Chapter 2. Things as they are. In our last chapter, we considered the source of all things, which we called the infinite. In this chapter we shall consider the all things itself, which men call the universe. Note that the word universe is derived from the Latin word unus, meaning one, and versor, meaning to turn, the combined word meaning, literally, one that turns, or moves. The Latin words indicate a close meaning, namely, one thing in motion, turning its several aspects, and assuming many changes of appearance. The writer does not intend touching upon theories of the origin of the universe, nor of its purpose, or of any design in its production or management, nor of its possible or probable end. These questions do not belong to our subject, and then again, as was said in the last chapter, speculation regarding it is devoid of results, and leads one to quicksands and bogs of mental reasoning, from which it is difficult to extract oneself. The answer to the riddle of the universe rests with the infinite. But it is different with the case of the manifested universe that is evidenced by our senses. Science is a different thing from metaphysics, and its process and mode of work are along different lines. And, much knowledge of things may be obtained from a consideration of it, remembering always, that its knowledge is confined to things, and not to that which is back of things. And, so let us consider the universe of things. Material science has held that the universe is composed of two principles, 1. Matter, 2. Energy or force. Some hold that these two principles really are aspects of the same thing, and that there is really but one principle, one aspect of which is shape, form, etc., and called matter, the other a quality manifesting in motion, which quality is called force. Others, the most radical, hold that there is nothing but matter, and that force and energy is but a quality, or power, inherent in matter. Others hold that force is the real thing and matter but a form of force. All branches hold to the idea that matter and energy are always found together, and cannot be thought of separately. Matter and force are held to be eternal, and infinite, it following that there can be no addition to, or subtraction from either, all apparent loss and gain, creation and destruction being but change of form or mode. God is declared unnecessary, and the universe is held to operate according to certain laws of matter or force, either or both, which are unchangeable and immutable, eternal and always valid. Mind and thought are held to be products of properties of matter or force, one or both, secreted, evolved, or produced in the brain. The soul is relegated to the waste heap, and discarded as useless in the new philosophy. Maleshot said, "Thought is a motion of matter," and Olbach, that matter enjoys the power of thinking. Natural laws are held to be sufficient for the explanation of all phenomena, although ignoring the fact that the reason has never before formed the conception of law, without thinking it necessary to think of a lawmaker, or a power to enforce and administer the law. However, the philosophers hold that it is no more difficult to think of such a law than to try to form an idea of space or eternity, both of which are unthinkable to the human reason, but both of which are admitted as self-evident facts. But notwithstanding this somewhat crude and raw reasoning, material science has accomplished a wonderful work in the world, and has brought to light facts of inestimable value to man in mastering the material world, and in forming correct ideas. 6. Of the solution of material difficulties. The facts of material science enables the world to cheerfully overlook its theories. and even the theories are rapidly undergoing a change, and, as we have stated, some of the most advanced scientists are rapidly reaching the position of the occultists and mystics, bringing with them a mass of facts to back them up, to exhibit to the occultists who dealt with principles rather than with details, or material facts, so far as fundamental theories were concerned. Each is boring his way through the mountain tunnel of the unknown, and both will meet in the center, their lines meeting each other without a variation. But the occultists will call the tunnel center mind, and the scientists will call it matter, but both will be speaking of the same thing. And the causer of the mountain will probably know that they both are right. But, we are speaking of the new school of advanced material science now, not of the old conservative all is matter people, who have been left behind. The new school speaks of substance now, instead of matter, and ascribes to substance the properties of matter, energy, and something that they call sensation, by which they mean mind in a crude form, and from which they say mind and soul evolved. This new school of scientists are very different from their predecessors. They are less hidebound, and far from being so cocksure. They are seeing matter melting into energy, and giving signs of sensation, and they are beginning to feel that, after all, there must be a thing in itself, that is the real basis of, or real thing in substance. There is heard very little among them about dead matter, blind force, or of the mechanical theory of life and the universe. Instead of it being a big machine, operated under mechanical laws, with life as the steam, the universe is beginning to be regarded as somehow filled with life, and science is finding new examples of life in unexpected quarters, and the dead matter area is being narrowed. Men who have followed the advances made by recent science are holding their breaths in awe and earnest expectation, and those who are pushing the inquiries and investigations to the furthest extent are showing by their eager faces and trembling hands that they feel that they are very close to the borderline separating the old materialism from a new science that will give thought and philosophy a new impetus and a new platform. Such men are feeling that they are seeing the old matter melting away into something else, the old theories are falling apart under the light of new discoveries, and these men feel that they are penetrating a new and hitherto unexplored region of the unknown. May success be theirs, for they are now on the right road to truth. In the following chapters we shall see frequent references to science, and when we use the word we shall know it means this new school of scientists, rather than the older school that is now being superseded. There is no conflict between true occultism and true science. Notwithstanding their directly opposite theories and ideals, they are merely looking at the truth from different viewpoints, at different sides of the same shield. A better day is coming, when they shall work together, instead of in opposition. There should be no partisanship in the search for truth. Things have worked this way: occultism would enunciate a theory or principle, but would not attempt to prove it by material facts, for it had not gathered the facts, having found the principle within the mind, rather than without. Then, after laughing at the occult theory or principle, science would search diligently for material facts to prove an opposite theory, and in so doing would unearth new facts that would support the occultist's contention. Then science would discard its old theory, that is, the younger men would, the old ones, never, and proceed to proclaim a new theory or principle, under a new name, and backed up with a mass of facts and experiments that would create a new school with many enthusiastic followers. The old claim of the occultists would then be forgotten or else go unrecognized under its old name, or disguised by the fantastic and bizarre coverings which some so-called occultists had draped around the original truth. But, so long as truth is being uncovered, what matters it who does the work, or by what name he calls his school? The movement is ever forward, and upward, what matter the banner under which the armies move? In this book the writer will advance a very different theory of the universe of all things from that of modern science, although he feels that his theory may easily be reconciled with the most advanced views of that school. In the first place, as he has stated in the first chapter, he does not hold that the universe, as we know it, is self-sufficient, but he recognizes a something back of all phenomena and appearances, which something he calls the infinite. And he differs very materially from the views of those who claim that mind is but a property, or quality, or something proceeding from matter or force, or matter-force, or force-matter, according to the views of the respective schools. He takes an entirely different and opposite position. He holds that all that we call matter, or substance, and mind, as we know it, are but aspects of something infinitely higher, and which may be called the cosmic mind. He holds that what we call mind is but a partial manifestation of the cosmic mind, and that substance or matter is but a cruder or grosser form of that which we call mind, and which has been manifested in order to give mind a body through which to operate. But this view he merely states in passing, for he makes no attempt to demonstrate or prove the same, his idea being that it forms a different part of the general subject than the phase of dynamic thought, to the consideration of which this book is devoted. He also differs very materially from the materialistic school in his conception of force or energy. Instead of regarding force as a distinct principle, and as something of which mind is but a form, he walks boldly out into the arena of scientific thought, and throwing down his gauntlet, proclaims his theory that there is no such thing as force apart from life and mind. All force and energy is the product of life and mind. All force, energy and motion result from vital mental action. All force, energy and motion is vital mental force, energy, and motion. The mind abiding in and permeating all substance, not only has the power to think, but also the power to act, and to manifest force and energy, which are its inherent and essential properties. He also takes the position that mind is in and about and around everything, and that everything is alive and thinking, and that there is no such things as dead matter, or blind force, but that all substance, even to the tiniest particle, is permeated with life and mind, and that all force and motion is caused and manifested by mind. He holds that all forms of force, energy, and motion, from the attraction of the particles of matter, and their movements in response thereto, up to the attraction of gravitation, and the response of the worlds, and suns, and stars, and planets, thereto, are forms of mental energy and force, and action. And that from the tiniest atom, or particle, to the greatest sun, all obey this great action of mind, this great force of mind, this great energy of mind, this great power of mind. And upon this rock of truth, he believes it to be, he takes his stand, and announces his belief, and bids all comers take notice of what he believes to be a germ thought that will grow, develop, and increase so that it will eventually permeate all scientific thought as the years roll along. He calls this theory the theory of dynamic thought. Chapter 3. The Universality of Life and Mind. The writer has deemed it advisable to preface his consideration of mind in itself, as well as of substance and motion, with 2 chapters, the purpose of which will be to demonstrate that mind, in some form or degree, is to be found in connection with all things, and that everything has life, and that mind is an accompaniment of all life. To many the term mind means only the thinking quality of man, or perhaps of the lower animals, and life the property only of such organic creatures. For that reason it has been deemed advisable to point out that life and mind are found even in the lowest forms of substance, even in the inorganic world. In this chapter and from now on, the writer shall use the term the mind, etc., to indicate the particular mental principle of the creature or thing, the bit of mind that is segregated from the rest, and which each person thinks of as mine, just as he thinks of my body, as distinguished from the universal supply of substance. The term mind will be used in its universal sense. And, the writer intends to use Elmer Gates' term, mentation, in the sense of effort, action, or effect, in or of the mind, in short, mental process. The word is useful, and when one has learned to use it, he will prefer it to the more complicated terms. Remember, then, please, mentation means mental process. Mentation includes that which we call thought, as well as some more elementary forms of mental process that we are not in the habit of dignifying by the term thought, which latter we usually reserve for mental process of a higher order. So, then, mind is the something of which one's particular mind is composed. The mind is that something possessed by one, by and through which he thinks. Mentation is mental process, and thought is advanced kind of mentation. At least, the said words will be so employed in this book, from now on. In this chapter, you are asked to consider the fact that life is universal, that everything is alive, and that mind and mentation is an attribute of life, and that, consequently, everything has mind, and is able to express a degree of mentation. Forms of life, as we know them, are always seen as possessing 2 aspects, viz., 1. Body, substance, and 2. Mentation, mind. The 2 aspects are always found in combination. There may be living creatures who occupy bodies of so fine a form of substance as to be invisible to the human senses, but their bodies would be substance just as much as is the body of the granite rock. And, in order to think, these beings would need to have a material something corresponding to the brain, though it be finer in quality than the rarest gas, vapor, of electric wave. No body, without mentation, no mentation without a body. This last is the invariable law of the world of things. And naught but the infinite, that which is above things, can be exempt from that law. In order to grasp the idea of the universality of mind, let us go back to the elementary forms of things, and, step by step, see how mentation manifests itself in every point on the scale from mineral to man, using bodies ranging from the hardest rock to that finest form of known substance, the brain of man. As mind advances in the scale of evolution, it creates its own working instrument, the body, including the brain, and shapes, and molds it to admit of the fullest possible expression of mentation possible at that stage. Mind is the molder, body, and brain, that which is molded. And inclination, desire, and will, are the motive powers leading to gradual unfoldment, the impelling cause being the craving for satisfaction. We shall make our journey backward, and ignoring beings higher in the scale, we shall start with man. Leaving out of the consideration, for the moment, the fact of the existence of the ego, or spirit of man, which is higher than body or mind, and considering the mind of man, rather than the man himself, we have our starting point on the downward journey of investigation. We need not devote much attention to the consideration of the mind of man, at this stage, although we shall have much to do with it, later on. But we may undertake a brief consideration of the descending degrees of mentation as manifested by man, as we pass down the scale in the human family, considering in turn, the Newtons, Shakespeares, Emersons, Edisons, and their brothers in intellect, in the field of mathematics, literature, music, art, invention, science, statesmanship, business, skilled workmanship, etc., respectively. From these high levels we pass down, gradually, through the strata of men of but a slightly lower degree of intellect, down through the strata of the average man, down through the strata of the ignorant man, down through the strata of the lowest type of our own race and time, down through the strata of the barbarian, then on to the savage, then on to the digger Indian, the bushman. What a difference from highest to lowest! A being from another world would doubt that they were all of the same family. Then we pass rapidly through the various strata of the lower animal kingdom, from the comparatively high degree of mentation of the horse, the dog, the elephant, etc., down through the descending scale of the mammals, the degree of mentation becoming less marked at each step of the journey. Then on through the bird kingdom. Then through the world of reptiles. Then through the family of fishes. Then through the millions of forms of insect life, including those wonderful creatures, the ant and the bee. Then on through the shellfish family. Then on through the community of sponges, polyps, and other low forms of life. Then on to the vast empire of the microscopic creatures, whose name is legion. Then on to the plant life, the highest of which have sensitive cells that resemble brains and nerves, descending by stages to the lower plant life. Then still lower to the world of bacteria, microbes, and infusoria, the groups of cells with a common life, the monera, the single cell. The mind that has followed us in this descent of life, from the highest form to the cell-like thing merely existing in the slime at the bottom of the ocean, has acquired a sense of awe and sublimity not dreamed of by the man on the street. The degrees of mentation in the lower animal kingdom are well known to all of us, therefore, we need not devote much time to their consideration at this time. Although the degree of mentation in some of the lowly forms of animal life, are scarcely above that of the plant life, in fact, are inferior to that of the highest plants, still we have accustomed ourselves to the use of the word mind in connection with even the lowest animals, while we hesitate to apply the word to the plants. It is true that some of us do not like to think of the lower animals' reasoning, so we use the word instinct to denote the degree of mentation of the lower animal. The writer does not object to the word, in fact, he shall use it for the sake of distinguishing between the several mental states. But, remember, instinct is but a term used to denote a lesser form of reason, and the instinct of the horse or dog is a fine thing when we consider the reason of the bushman or digger Indian. However, we shall not quarrel about words. Both reason and instinct mean degrees or forms of mentation, the word we are using. The lower forms of animal life exhibit mentation along the lines of sex action, feeling and taste. Then by degrees come smell, hearing and sight. And then something very like reasoning in the case of the dog, elephant, horse, etc. Mentation everywhere in the animal kingdom, in some degree. No doubt about life and mentation there. But what about mentation and life in the plant life? All of you admit that there is life there, but about mentation, well, let us see. Some of you draw the line at the word mind in connection with plants, although you freely admit the existence of life there. Well, remember our axiom, no life without mentation. Let us try to apply it. A moment's reflection will give you instances of mentation among the plants. Science has called it appetency, rather than admit mind, the word appetency being defined as an instinctive tendency on the part of low forms of organic life to perform certain acts necessary for their well-being, such as to select and absorb such particles of matter as serve to support and nourish them. Well, that looks like a degree of mentation, doesn't it? Many young animals evidence little or nothing more than appetency in suckling. We shall adopt the word appetency to designate the mentation in plant life. Remember this, please. Anyone who has raised trees or plants has noticed the instinctive efforts of the plant to reach the water and sunlight. Potatoes in dark cellars have been known to send forth shoots 20 feet in length in order to reach an opening in the wall. Plants have been known to bend over during the night and dip their leaves in a pot of water several inches away. The tendrils of climbing plants seek for the stake or support, and find it, too, although it has been changed daily. The tendril will retwine itself, after it has been untwisted and bent in another direction. The tips of the roots of the tree are said to show a sensitiveness almost akin to that of the limb of an animal, and evidently possess something akin to nerve matter. Demel placed some beans in a cylinder of moist earth. When they began to sprout, he turned the cylinder around quarter way of its circumference, then a little more the next day, and so on, a little each day, until the cylinder had described a complete revolution, had been turned completely around. Then the beans were taken from the earth, and lo! The roots and sprouts formed a complete spiral. With every turn of the cylinder the roots and sprouts had changed their position and direction, the roots striving to grow downward, and the sprouts striving to grow upward until the spiral had formed. Akin to this is the boy's trick of uprooting a sprouting seed, and replanting it upside down, in which case the sprouts begin to turn a semicircle until it is able to grow straight up to the surface of the earth, while the roots describe a semicircle until they can grow downward once more. And so on, story after story of appetency or mentation in plants might be told, until we reach the insect-catching species, when even the most conservative observer is forced to admit that, well, it does almost seem like thinking, doesn't it? Any lover of plants, flowers or trees, and who has been able to study them at first hand, does not need much argument to prove that plant life exhibits traces of mentation, some of it pretty far advanced, too. Some lovers of plants go so far as to claim that one must love plants before they will succeed in growing them, and that the plants feel and respond to the feeling. But the writer does not insist upon this, but merely mentions it in passing. Before leaving the subject of mentation in plants, the writer is tempted to steal a little more space and tell you that plants do more than receive sensations of light and moisture. They exhibit a rudimentary taste as well. Haeckel relates an interesting story of an insect-catching plant. He states that while it will bend its leaves when any solid body, excepting a raindrop, touches its surface, still it will secrete its acrid digestive fluid only when that object happens to be nitrogenous, meat or cheese. The plant is able to distinguish its meat diet, its food being insectivorous, and while it will supply its gastric juice for meat and cheese, as well as for the insect, it will not do so for other solids to which it is indifferent. He also mentions the fact that roots of trees and plants are able to taste the different qualities of soil, and will avoid poor soil and plunge into the richer parts of the earth. The sexual organism and life of plants also affords a great field for study to the student hunting for evidences of life and mentation in that kingdom. The motion or circulation of the sap in trees and plants was formerly considered to be due to capillary attraction and purely mechanical laws, but recent scientific experiments have shown it to be a vital action, an evidence of life and mentation, the experiments having proven that if the cell substance of the plant was poisoned or paralyzed, the circulation of sap immediately ceased, although the mechanical principles had not been interfered with in the least. And now on to the mineral kingdom. What, you may cry, mind and mentation in the mineral and chemical world? Surely not. Yes, even in these low planes may be found traces of mental action. There is life everywhere, even there. And where there is life there is mind. Away back among the chemical principles, and the minerals we may go in our search for life and mind, they cannot escape us, even there. Chapter 4. Life and Mind Among the Atoms. To the majority of persons the title of this chapter would seem an absurdity. Not to speak of inorganic mind, the idea of life in the inorganic world would seem a ridiculous paradox to the man on the street who thinks of substance as dead, lifeless and inert. And, to tell the truth, even science has held this view until a comparatively recent period, laughing to scorn the old occult teaching that the universe is alive, and capable of thinking. But the recent discoveries of modern science has changed all this, and we no longer hear science speaking of dead matter or blind force. It recognizes that these terms are meaningless, and that the dreams of the old occultists are coming true. Science confronts a live and thinking universe. She is dazzled by the sight, and would shade her eyes, fearing to see that which she feels must present itself to her vision when her eyes become accustomed to the sight. But a few daring minds among the scientific investigators are dreaming wonderful dreams today, and they tell us in broken tones of the wonderful visions that are passing before their sight. They dare not tell it all, for they fear the ridicule of their fellows. Their visions are of life, universal life. In its investigations of the material, science has penetrated so far into the recesses of things that its most advanced thinkers and investigators now find themselves standing in the presence of the immaterial. Science today is proclaiming the new doctrine, That is the same as the old doctrine of the occultists, the doctrine of life everywhere, life even in the hardest rock. Before entering into a consideration of the evidence of mentation in the inorganic world, let us accustom ourselves to the idea of something like life being found there. It will be better for us to approach the subject by easy stages. Where there is life there must be mind, so let us first look for evidences of life. The man on the street would require something more tangible than scientific explanations of sensation, attraction, etc. What can we offer him as an illustration? Let us see. Suppose we call the attention of the man to the fact that metals get tired after considerable work without periods of rest. Science calls this the fatigue of elasticity. When the metals are given rest, they recuperate and regain their former elasticity and health. The man may remember that his razor acts this way occasionally, and if he talks the matter over with his barber, his suspicions will be verified. Then, if he consults a musician friend, he will be informed that tuning forks also become tired and lose their vibrating quality until they are given a rest. Then his machinist friend will tell him that machinery in factories must be given a rest occasionally, else it will begin to disintegrate and die. Machinery will go on a strike for a rest if it is overworked. Then metals contract disease. Science informs us that zinc and tin have been infected, and the infection has spread from sheet to sheet, crumbling the metal into powder, the spread of the infection resembling the spread of a plague among animals or plant life. Science has experimented with copper and iron, and has found that these metals may be poisoned with chemicals, and will remain in a weakened condition until antidotes are administered. Window glass workers declare that there is such a thing as glass disease, that will ruin fine stained glass windows unless the infected panes are removed. The glass disease starts with one pane, and spreads gradually to the entire window, and from there to other windows. Metallurgists have found that when metallic ores are put under certain forms of pressure, they seem to lose strength, and become weak until the pressure is removed. Do these things mean anything to the man of the street? Another step in the consideration of life in the inorganic world is the realization of the fact that, after all, there is but the very finest line separating the higher forms of mineral life from the lower forms of vegetable life, or the life of those things which we may call either plants or animals. The lifeline is being pushed further back every day by scientific investigation, and the living thing of today was the inanimate thing of yesterday. We hear much talk in the newspapers about some scientist or another discovering life or creating life in some inanimate substance. Bless your hearts, you who are alarmed by these reports. No one can create life in anything, for it already exists there. The discovery is simply the realization of this fact. Science, by means of the microscope, has brought to light forms of living things, resembling in appearance the fine dust of inorganic minerals. These low forms of life exhibit but the simplest vital processes, the same very closely resembling chemical processes, although just a shade higher in the scale. Living creatures have been found which could be dried and laid aside like dust for several years, and then revived by being immersed in water, when they would resume their vital process as if they had been awakened from a sleep. Forms of life, called bacilli, have been discovered that can pass through degrees of heat and cold that can be expressed only by vague symbols or figures, the heat and cold being so intense that the unscientific mind cannot imagine it. In appearance the diatoms resemble the chemical crystals. These diatoms are minute one-celled living things, having a hard but thin siliceous covering or shell, of extreme delicacy. They are what are known as microscopic creatures, that is, visible only through the microscope. Some of them are so small that it would take 1,000 or more to cover the head of a pin. But, remember this, the microscope reveals them as living creatures performing vital functions. They are found in the deep waters of the ocean. To the naked eye they appear like fine sand or dirt, but under the most powerful microscope, they are seen to comprise many species and varieties, exhibiting many peculiar shapes and forms. In fact, they have been called living geometrical forms, their shapes and appearances almost exactly resembling those of the chemical and mineral crystals. Science informs us that these and similar microscopic creatures number thousands of families or species, and it is thought that the varieties of microscopic creatures outnumber the varieties of creatures visible to the unaided sight. And, remember, that there is probably a still greater world of submicroscopic creatures, that is a world invisible even when the most powerful microscope is used. Who knows what wonders are to be found there, what forms of creatures live, and move and have their being there. In passing, by the subject of the resemblance between the outward forms of living things and the crystals, it is interesting to note how the crystals of frost and ice resemble the forms of leaves, branches, flowers, foliage, etc. The pane of glass covered with these frosty forms resembles a garden. The disk of saltpeter, under the effect of polarized light, very closely resembles the form of the orchid. Recent scientific experiments have shown that certain metallic salts, when subjected to a galvanic current, group themselves around one of the poles of the battery, and assume a mushroom-like shape and appearance. At first, they seem to be transparent, but gradually they assume color, the top becoming a bright red, with the underside showing a pale rose color, the stem being of a pale straw color. The discoverers of these peculiar forms called them by the German equivalent for inorganic mushrooms, but even this term seems scarcely worthy of them, for they even show a trace of something like organs. Under the microscope they are seen to have fine canals or vein-like channels running through their stems, from top to base. And through these veins the thing absorbed fresh material and actually grew like low forms of fungus life. Were these things merely minerals or chemical substances, or were they low forms of organic life? The lines between the inorganic and the organic are being wiped out rapidly. The supreme power that caused life to be, caused it to all, and did not divide its manifestations into dead things and live things, but breathed into all the breath of life. And the more clearly we see the actual evidence of this, the greater does that supreme power seem to us. A very low form of living creatures called the Menera, is held by science to be the one of the strands of the connecting link between the organic and inorganic worlds. The Menera are the lowest and simplest form, at least so far known, of organic life. They may be said to be organic creatures without organs, being but little more than simple cells, tiny globules of plasm, surrounded by a thin membrane, their sole vital function being the absorption of nourishment through the pores of their covering, just as a piece of chalk would absorb water, and the consequent conversion of the nourishment into material for growth, the whole process resembling chemical action. The Menera reproduce their kind simply by cleavage or separation of the substance of the mother cell into two, and so on, being little more than the growth of crystals. The Menera are everywhere recognized, without question, as living creatures, but they exhibit merely a trace more of life than do certain forms of crystals. The difficulty in considering crystals as living things is partially due to the outward form and substance, so different from the form and substance of the higher living things. But we have seen that the diatoms took on shapes of crystals, and that the outer shell or covering was similar to silicia, a mineral, the inner substance being but a tiny speck of plasm, similar to that of the substance of a plant cell. And then we may look to the tiny bit of chalk dust which was once the skeleton form of a living creature. The same is true of coral. In the very low forms of life, the skeleton, or form, is the thing most apparent, the plasm of living substance being still smaller, and less apparent. And yet, the skeleton, or shell, was formed by the vital processes of the creature, and was a part of its body, just as is the skeleton or bony structure of the higher animals. And, in the same sense it is living substance. And, remember, that there is but little difference between these bodies of the low forms of life, and the bodies of crystals. And the chemical constituents of its plasmic inner body is but slightly different from that of the crystals. And its nature and vital process are by a shade higher in the scale than those of the crystals. You may ask why we have said so much of crystals. The reason is just this: science has begun to think of crystals as semi-living things, and its most advanced investigators and thinkers go further and assert that the crystals are alive. Crystallization is an evidence of life process. Crystals arrange themselves in well-known and well-defined shapes, direction and order of formation being observed implicitly. Each crystal follows the laws and habits of its kind, just as do plants and animals. Its lines of crystallization are mathematically perfect, and according to the laws of its being. Not only this, but some substances have a range of 6 or 7 different forms of crystal forms possible to them. In some cases a chemical element assumes one form of crystallization when it manifests as one mineral, and a second form when it manifests in another form. In each case, however, it manifests along well-known and recognized courses of action, movement, and shapes. Crystals may be killed by a strong electrical discharge, that is, they are so affected that they disintegrate, their atoms separating to form new combinations, just as is the case with the bodies of higher forms of life. Some scientists have gone so far as to claim that they had discovered something akin to rudimentary sex action in certain crystals, resembling the sex process of the lowest plant life. But this has not, as yet, been positively established, although it seems probable and reasonable. A recent writer in one of the magazines has said, "Crystallization, as we are to learn now, is not a mere mechanical grouping of dead atoms. It is a birth." This may seem mere scientific poetry until the process of crystallization is carefully studied, when it will be seen to give evidence, not only of something like vital and mental action, but also something very much like reproductive functioning of the lower forms of life. There is an assimilation of material to build up the crystal in the first place, just as an animal assimilates matter to build up its shell, or a tree to form its bark. The form of the crystal is truly its body, and behind and in the body there is something at work that is not the body, but which is forming it. And, later on, that crystal increases in size, and then begins to separate into two, throwing off a smaller crystal, identical in form with the parent crystal. This manner of reproduction is almost identical with the process of reproduction in the lower forms of life, which consist merely of a like separation of the parent form into two, and the throwing off of the offspring. The principal difference between the growth of crystals and of the Menera is that the crystals grow by absorbing fresh matter and attaching it to their outer surface, while the Menera grow by absorbing fresh material and growing outwardly, from within. But this may be accounted for by the difference in the density of their bodies, the crystal being very solid, while the Menera is like a thin jelly. If the crystal had a soft interior, it could grow like the Menera or diatom, but then it would be a diatom. The process of crystallization is accountable only by the theory that in the crystal there exists something like life and mentation. There is something more than mere mechanical motion, or blind chance at work here. Does not the process of crystallization look like rudimentary purpose of action? It may be said that it is movement and action in accordance with some established law of nature granted. But is not that also true of the physical processes and growth of higher forms of life? Is the forming of the crystal form to be considered as a mechanical effect, and the forming of the shell of the Menera to be considered a mental and vital action? If so, wherefore? The point is that crystals act as if they are alive, and capable of assimilation, growth, and reproduction, in a manner and degree differing but very slightly from corresponding functioning of the lower forms of life. Verily the crystals are alive, and if alive they must have at least a trace of mind. Does it not appear that they exhibit something very like both? Quoting from a recent writer, let us notice that, recent investigations in the new department of science, which has been termed plasmology, show in crystals phenomena which are absolutely analogous to vital phenomena, so much so that photographs of certain forms produced in the changes of crystals appear to be almost exact duplicates of those in the various lower forms of microbes. The question has been raised as to whether the microbe is no more alive than the crystal, or the latter equally endowed with life as is the former. And now another step, in our search for life. Remember, that the hardest rocks are composed of crystals of certain kinds. And, if the higher crystals have life, then it is only fair to suppose that the lower and cruder forms are likewise endowed, even if in a still lower degree. And if all crystals are endowed with life, then the most solid rocks, being composed of aggregations of crystals, must be masses of inorganic life, and consequently, of inorganic mind. A crystal, according to Webster, is the regular form, bounded by plane surfaces, which a substance tends to assume in solidifying, through the inherent powers of cohesive attraction. That definition of Webster tells the whole story, and we see that a crystal is merely a regular form of a substance, which the substance tends to assume in solidifying, that is, in reassuming a solid form after being in a liquid or melted state, and that is just what all the rocks of the earth did when they emerged from the melted state in which they existed in the early days of the world's history. And this tendency that caused them to solidify, and assume certain crystal forms, and which must have existed potentially through the melted state, what of that? What is this tendency or force? The definition answers, the inherent powers of cohesive attraction. So, here is cohesive attraction, that we shall consider fully in forthcoming chapters of this book. Inherent, too, the definition says. What is inherent? Let us see. Webster defines inherent as permanently existing. So this power of cohesive attraction permanently existed in the substance or else in connection with it. Let us take another look at cohesive attraction. Cohesive attraction is that form of universal attraction that causes the molecules of a body to draw together, that invisible power of the molecule, by which it draws another molecule toward itself, and itself toward the other, the manifestation of which power by several molecules tends to draw each of them together. We shall learn of these particles of substance called molecules before long. It is a primal cause of motion, this mutual attraction, and drawing power. Now is it reasonable to suppose that this wonderful power is a mere blind force? Is it not more reasonable to think of it as a form of vital action, life action? Dead things could not manifest this force in action. And if this cohesive attraction is an evidence of life, then all substance must have life manifesting through it. Not only the rocks, but the soil and earth and dirt, for they are but crumbled rock. And, when we thus consider substance, as being the body through which life is manifesting, we must not lose sight of the molecules and atoms, in our consideration of the mass. A bit of rock, crystal, or dirt, is but an aggregation of countless molecules, grouped together in certain crystallized shapes and forms, each having characteristics of its own. These molecules cling together, in accordance with their mutual attractive powers. And each of these molecules is composed of a number of atoms, which cling together in accordance with chemical affinity, or chemisium, but which is but another name for attraction, or cohesion, and which form a little family, called a molecule. And these atoms are composed of corpuscles. We will waive the consideration of the corpuscle, for the moment, but even if we consider it, we only carry the subject back a step farther. What we wish to say, could be said even if there were 10 further divisions of substance, or 1,000,000, for that matter. The point we wish you to consider now, is that we must separate the mass into its constituents, its molecules, atoms, and even corpuscles, in our search for the life in the mineral and chemical world. If there is life in the mass, there must be life in the molecule, atom, or corpuscle. Now, do we find it there? Certainly, for the tiniest atom manifests its attractive power, and not only does it draw other atoms to itself by virtue thereof, but it even goes a step further, and shows a preference, a degree of liking in its mutual relations with other atoms. We shall see, in future chapters, that there is desire, love, marriage, and divorce among the chemical atoms. We shall consider the flirtations, and love affairs of certain atoms. We shall see how an atom will leave another, and fly to a new charmer. We shall have many evidences of the atom's power to receive sensations, and to respond to the same. Nothing dead about this, is there? The atom is very much alive. The attraction, affinity, and motions, of the atom, give a certain evidence of something very much like life, as we see it in higher forms. In the atom exists all the life that causes crystallization. And in the atom lies that which causes force and motion to manifest. Verily, the atom lives and moves and has its being. And, so our journey is ended, we have traced life to its last stages of manifestations, and we have found it there, and at each step of the journey. But, stop, we have not completed our journey, we have but begun it. Why, some of us may cry, how can we go back of the atom, or electron? The answer is into the ether. Yes, back of the atom in the corpuscle, is said by science to lie that wonderful, paradoxical something they call the universal ether, that something that science has considered the womb of matter and force, something that is different from anything ever known or dreamed of by man, that something which science has labored so diligently to build up, and which it has used as an explanation for so much phenomena, but regarding which, of very recent date, there has begun to grow a distrust and a suspicion, owing to the discovery of radiant matter, and things that followed in its train. But, notwithstanding these shadowy suspicions, science still asserts in belief in the constancy and integrity of the ether, and it behooves us to investigate that wonderful region in which it dwells, in order to see whether life and mind are also to be found there. We think that, in the words of the street, we shall find that they are very much there. And, so in later chapters of this book, we shall consider the ethereal region very fully. But before doing so, we had better give substance and motion, in all their forms, a careful consideration, for a correct understanding of them is vitally necessary for an intelligent conception of the ideas underlying the philosophy to be herein set forth. Now, pray do not leave this chapter with the belief that the writer has said that the particles of inorganic substance are endowed with conscious reasoning powers. Nothing of the kind has been said, nothing of the kind is meant. The life and mind evidenced in the particles are but the faintest glimmerings. There is no sign of consciousness or reasoning the mind exhibited is less than that of the plant, yes, less than even that of the cell of the plant. The life is evidenced by power to move, and the mind is evidenced by the ability to receive impressions and to respond to the same by evidencing force and movement. There is no evidence of consciousness or understanding in these mental processes. Consciousness is not an essential attribute of life or mind action. In fact, but a small part of even the mentation of man is performed in the field of consciousness. Nearly all of his bodily functions are beneath the field of consciousness. One does not consciously regulate the beating of his heart, the circulation of his blood, the digestion and assimilation of his food, the tearing down and building up work of the cells, the work of the organs, etc., etc. Yes, these processes are all mental processes, and far from mere mechanical movements, or chemical processes, as some imagine. Let the spark of life leave the body, and the processes stop, although all the chemicals are still there, and the mechanical movements might go on unhindered. The particles of substance have enough life and mind to enable them to move, receive and respond to impressions, and to exert force in accordance with the law of attraction, but there it stops. The crystals show signs of something like taking nourishment, but the real taking of food may be said to commence with the Menera. Not until very high degrees of life and mind are attained, do creatures begin to exhibit consciousness, and that which is called understanding is still higher in the scale, and not until man is reached does the faculty of turning the mental searchlight inward manifest itself. These matters are mentioned here merely to prevent misunderstanding and misapprehension. But still, do not forget, the particles of substance receive impressions and respond thereto, they act and exert force and energy, they manifest life and mentation. Chapter 5. The Story of Substance. As we stated, in a former chapter, there are two aspects of all things, viz. 1. Substance, 2. Mind. In this, and the following two chapters we shall consider the first one, substance, which science calls matter. Perhaps it would be as well to begin by asking ourselves the question, what is substance? The answer seems to be, anything that takes up room, the body aspect of things, matter occupying space, etc. Some writers have spoken of substance as something tangible, that can be felt, but this definition will not do, for there are forms of substance too fine to be felt. And so, perhaps the definition the body of things, is as good a definition as any, taken in connection with the thought that it takes up room. Science divides substance, which it calls matter, into four general classes, viz. 1. Solid matter, which is substance, the parts of which closely adhere and resist impression, such as stone, wood, flesh, etc., the degrees of solidity varying greatly, and sometimes shading into the next class, which is called 2. Liquid matter, which may be described as substance, the parts of which have a free motion among themselves, and easily yield to impression, such as water, molasses, etc., the degree of fluidity ranging from some liquids that flow very slowly, such as hot pitch, up to others that flow very freely, such as water, wine, etc., the property of fluidity being also shared by the next higher class, which is called 3. Aeriform matter, which is substance in the form of elastic fluid, such as air, gas, vapor, etc. and 4. Radiant matter, which is of recent recognition, and which is an ultra-gaseous form of substance, utterly unlike anything ever before known, consisting of the tiniest particles of corpuscles of substance finer and more subtle than the rarest form of atomic substance known to science. The three classes are well represented by 1. Earth, solid, 2. Water, liquid, 3. Air, aeriform, 4. The corpuscles or electrons, or particles of electrified substance, first noticed in connection with the X-rays, radium, etc. But it must be remembered that these four classes of substance are not fixed or permanent, on the contrary they are changeable either under pressure, when subjected to heat, or under the influence of electricity, etc. In fact, the word condition is more applicable than the term class. The condition or class of a particle of substance may be changed into another class or condition by the application of the agencies above named. The same substance may exist in two or three classes, under different circumstances. Solids may be changed into liquids, and liquids into gases, and vice versa. Metals may be melted, then changed into gas, according to the degree of heat applied. Liquids may be changed into vapor by the application of heat, or into solids by the withdrawal of heat. For an example, we may turn to water, which is a solid in the condition of ice, a liquid in the condition of water, and steam in the condition of vapor. Quicksilver is a metal which is in a liquid condition in our ordinary temperature, but which becomes a solid when subjected to a very low degree of temperature, and may be transformed into a gas, under a high degree of heat. Air is a vapor in our ordinary temperature, but has been transformed into liquid air under tremendous pressure, which produced a very low degree of temperature, and, theoretically, it may be transformed into a solid under a sufficiently low degree of temperature, although so far, science has not been able to produce a degree of cold sufficient to freeze the liquid air. It is all a matter of freeze, melt, and evaporate, in all forms of substance, and any substance, at least theoretically, is capable of being subjected to any of the three conditions just named, and being manifested in the respective conditions, of solid, liquid, and aeriform. This may actually be accomplished with the majority of substances at this time, although in some instances we are not able to produce a sufficiently high temperature to melt and evaporate certain solid substances, on the one hand, or a sufficiently low degree of temperature to liquefy or freeze solid certain vapors. But the intense heat of the center of the Earth is able to melt rocks, and show them as liquid lava flowing from volcanoes, and science teaches that the solid substance of the Earth, and other planets, suns, etc., existed in the shape of a vapor at one time, and would again take on that condition in case of a collision with another great body, which convert motion into intense heat that would first melt, and then vaporize every solid particle of which the Earth is composed. If the sun's heat were completely to die out, The cold would be so intense that the air around the Earth, and all the gases and vapors, would be frozen to solids. In physics, the term gas is generally applied to a substance that is aeriform in our ordinary temperature, but which may be liquefied in a low temperature, the term vapor being generally applied to the aeriform condition of substances that are solid or liquid in our ordinary temperatures, but which may be evaporated by heat, and thus transformed into an aeriform condition, resuming their original form upon cooling. These terms, however, are technical, and practically there is no difference between a gas and a vapor. In the above statements regarding the possibility of the transformation of each of the several forms of substance into other forms, the reference has been applied only to the three better-known forms, i.e., solid, liquid, and aeriform. The fourth form or state of substance, known as radiant matter, is of too recent discovery to admit of its properties being accurately observed. The best and latest opinion of science, however, is that it constitutes what may be called primal matter, that is substance from which all other forms, states, kinds and varieties of substance arise, the stuff from which they are manufactured. Science seems to be discarding the ether theory of the origin of matter, in favor of this primal matter. Physical science divides substance into masses, molecules, and atoms, that is, the old physical science did, but the later investigators now see that even the atom may be subdivided. But the old terms may as well be used, at least for the time being. Let us consider these divisions. A mass is a quantity of substance considered as a whole, but which is composed of a collection or combination of parts, molecules. A lump of coal, a piece of iron, a portion of meat, even a drop of water, is a mass. The only requisite for a mass is that it contains two or more parts or molecules. Therefore a mass is a collection or combination of two or more molecules, considered as a whole. A molecule is the physical unit of substance, or, in other words, the smallest part of any kind of substance that can exist by itself and still remain that particular kind of substance. But not the smallest chemical part. The latter is called an atom, and atoms combine to form a molecule. The molecule exists as a unit, and cannot be split or separated by physical means, although it may be separated into atoms by chemical means. In order that we may form a clear idea of the molecule, let us take a very small mass of matter, a drop of water, for instance. This drop of water is a mass composed of a great number of molecules. It may be divided, and subdivided, into smaller and still smaller parts. This division may be carried on until it reaches a point where our sight and instruments are unable to make a further subdivision. But, theoretically, the work may be carried on still further, until at last a limit is reached where we are unable to divide the water into any smaller parts, without separating its chemical constituents from each other, in which latter case there would be no water at all, its chemical constituents, or atoms, having separated and now appearing as two atoms of hydrogen and one atom of oxygen, separated and apart and no longer forming a molecule of water. Well, this smallest possible part of water, or any other form of substance, is a molecule. Remember, the molecule is the smallest part of that kind of substance that can be produced by division and subdivision, without destroying the kind of the substance. It is the smallest part of any kind of substance that can exist by itself, and maintain its kind. In order that you may grasp the minuteness of the molecule, we may mention that science claims that no molecule, even the largest, is of sufficient magnitude to be seen under even the strongest microscope. It has been calculated that if a drop of water as large as a pea were magnified to the size of the Earth, the molecules would then appear no larger than the original drop. The space between the molecules is believed to be considerably larger than the molecules themselves. The figures that are necessary to use in connection with molecular substance are likely to stagger the imagination. Besides speaking of the molecules of inorganic substance, it may be interesting to note that a spider's thread is so fine that a piece of it large enough to circle the Earth would weigh only half a pound. And yet each thread is composed of 6,000 filaments. And each of these minute filaments may be divided into tiny bits, and each bit will still be a mass of substance containing thousands of molecules and their constituent chemical atoms. There are living, microscopic creatures, so small that 5 millions of them might be crowded into a space the size of a pinhead. And yet each of them have organs. And in these organs fluids circulate. Try to figure out the size of the molecules of the fluid circulating in these tiny organs, not to speak of the chemical atoms. When you handle a coin, an infinitesimal portion of it is worn off. Can you figure the size of the molecules composing that part? When a rose throws off its perfume, it emanates tiny particles of itself. Can you measure or weigh the molecules composing that odor? The human mind is compelled to realize its finiteness when it considers these things, but we have only just begun to consider the smallness of things. An atom is the chemical unit of substance, that is, the smallest chemical part that can enter into combination. It has been considered indivisible, that is, incapable of further subdivision. That is, it has been so considered, until very recently, but the latest discoveries have exploded this idea, and have shown the atom is composed of certain other things, as we shall see a little later on. Still, we may use the atom as a very good unit of measurement, for it still represents the unit of chemical substance, just as the molecule is the unit of physical substance. In order that you may understand the difference between molecules and atoms, physical units, and chemical units, let us give you a few examples. Take a molecule of water, the physical unit. You remember. When it is chemically separated or analyzed, it is found to contain 2 atoms of hydrogen, and 1 atom of oxygen, both chemical units, remember, which when united and combined, form water, but which when separated are simple atoms of certain chemical gases. The proportion in water is always the same, 2 of hydrogen and 1 of oxygen. This is the only partnership that will form water. The molecule of table salt contains 1 atom of sodium and 1 of chlorine. The molecule of air contains 5 chemical gases, of which nitrogen and oxygen are the principal ones, the proportion being about 3 parts of nitrogen to 1 of oxygen. Some molecules are far more complex. For instance, the molecule of sugar is composed of 45 chemical atoms, and sulfuric acid of 7. An atom is estimated at 1,250,000,000 of an inch in diameter. But this is not all. The old theory of the finality and ultimateness of the atom has been shattered by the recent discoveries of science. The atom of hydrogen was formerly considered to be the refinement of substance, the ultimate atom, the smallest and finest atom possible or known, the last thing that could be imagined about substance. Some even went so far as to declare that the atom of hydrogen was the ultimate element, that is the element out of which all other atoms were made, the mother of atoms, the origin of substance. It was supposed that all other atoms of matter were composed of a varying number of hydrogen atoms, which themselves were vortex rings in the ether, and that analysis could go no further. Science rested on its source, and pronounced the work of a century completed. But alas! No sooner was this position reached, than the discovery of radiant matter and the formulation of the corpuscle theory brought down the whole theoretical structure, and science was compelled to take up the hunt again, and to probe further into the inner recesses of things for the ultimate thing. But, nevertheless, atoms still exist, although their finality is no longer urged. The facts remain, although the theory has fallen. Let us see about this latest theory, the corpuscle or electron theory. The discovery of radiant matter, and the investigation of the late discovery of radium, has led to the further discovery that each atom, instead of being a thing in itself, is a little mass containing numerous other things called corpuscles, or electrons, because electrified. The theory is this, briefly, that each atom is a minute mass of substance containing a number of electrified particles, which are known as electrons, in constant motion and vibration, revolving around each other, as do the planets, suns, and moons of the universe. In fact, each chemical atom is like unto a universe in itself. The simplest atom, that which was supposed to be the ultimate atom, the atom of hydrogen, is supposed to contain within its tiny self no less than 1,000 minute corpuscles, which because electrified are called electron, revolving in fixed and regular orbits within the containing globe of the atom. The more complex forms of atoms are supposed to contain a far greater number of electrons, the authorities estimating those in an atom of oxygen at 10,000, those in an atom of gold, 100,000, and those in an atom of radium, 150,000. These figures are of course mere scientific guesses, but when compared with the similar guess regarding the size of the atom, they give a startling illustration of the size of the newly discovered corpuscle or electron. Another authority, for an illustration, asks us to consider a great globe about 100 feet in diameter, that is, of course, 100 feet through its center. Let the globe represent the atom. Then imagine 1,000 minute specks, each the size of a pinpoint, composed of substance, and each containing, as in a capsule, an atom of electricity. Each speck is revolving around each other in a regular orbit, in that great 100 feet through globe, and keeping well away from one another. That will give you an idea of the relative size of the electrons and atoms, and the room that the former have to move about in. Good many feet between each, you will notice. Lots of room, and plenty to spare. Try to figure out the size of an electron. Many readers of the magazines have been confused as to the relation between the corpuscles and the electrons, or ions, as some have called the latter. The matter is very simple. They are both the same. The corpuscle is the tiny particle of matter, which because it is electrified and has thus become the unit of electricity, is called an electron. From the viewpoint of substance we call the tiny particle a corpuscle. From the viewpoint of electricity, we call it an electron. These electrons are the tiny particles that pour forth from the pole in the Crookes tube, and constitute what are known as X-rays, cathode rays, Becquerel rays, etc. They also are the particles that are thrown off and emitted by radium, and similar substances. They exist in the atom, as explained, but also are found free and independent, and in the last condition or state are thrown off in the aforesaid rays, and by radium, etc. So far the corpuscles are known only as charged with electricity, and the electron only as a tiny charge of electricity with which the corpuscle is charged. But science dreams of corpuscles of substance other than electrons, in which case the old occult teachings of light dust and heat dust, etc., will be verified. The electron contains a powerful charge of electricity, as much in fact as an atom, 1,000 to 150,000 times its size will carry. But science is wondering how these highly charged particles manage to hold together in the atom, so rigidly coherent as to appear indestructible. We think that we may get a hint at the matter a little later on in this book. Science, or at least some scientists, are wondering whether the whirl or vibration of the corpuscle might not produce that which we call electricity, and whether, when this motion is intensified, waves of electricity will not be emitted. The writer fully agrees with this idea, and finds that it fits closely his own theories regarding substance and motion. But the reader is cautioned against falling into the error of many recent popular writers on the subject, some of whom have used terms calculated to convey the idea that the corpuscle, electron, is electricity itself, rather than tiny particles of substance called corpuscles, charged with the unitary charge of electricity, and therefore called electrons. But for that matter, electricity is only known to us as associated with some form of substance, and not as a thing in itself. We shall see the reason for this as we proceed with this book. These corpuscles are destined to play a most important part in the theories of science from now on. They already have overturned several very carefully and laboriously erected theoretical structures, and many more will follow, among the many important ones evidently doomed to the dust heap being the vortex ring atomic theory, and other theories built upon the etheric origin of matter, and other theories concerning the ether, even to the extent of breaking down the theory of the ether itself, which theory had almost come to be considered a law. We shall further consider the corpuscles, and their qualities, characteristics, etc., in the next chapter, for they have an important bearing upon the theories advanced in the course of the study of this book. Chapter 6. Substance and Beyond. Science has ascribed to substance certain characteristic qualities which it calls properties. It divides these properties into two classes, viz. 1. Molecular properties, sometimes called physical properties, and 2. Atomic properties, sometimes called chemical properties. Molecular properties are those which may be manifested by substance without disturbing the molecules, and consequently without affecting the kind of substance. Atomic properties are those which concern the atoms when free from molecular combination, and which consequently cannot be manifested without changing the kind of substance. Science, before long, is likely to add a third class of properties, namely, corpuscular properties, relating to the corpuscles or particles of radiant matter, but, so far, it has not had the opportunity to sufficiently observe these qualities, except in a general way. There are certain general properties that seem possessed by both mass, molecules, and atoms, and probably by corpuscles. These general properties are as follows. Shape, that property whereby substance takes up room. This property manifests in three directions, called dimensions of space, namely, length, breadth, and thickness. Weight, that property whereby substance responds to gravity. Weight is simply the measure of the attraction. Impenetrability, that property whereby two bodies of substance are prevented from occupying the same space at the same time. A nail driven into a piece of wood simply pushes aside the molecules, and occupies the space between them. Substance is never actually invaded or its actual territory occupied by other substance. Indestructibility, that property whereby substance is prevented from being destroyed or annihilated. Although the forms of substance may be changed, or transformed into other forms, still, substance in itself is not destroyed, and cannot be under the existing laws of the universe. Mobility, that property whereby substance responds to imparted motion. We shall notice this property in our consideration of motion. In addition to the motion of the mass, and the movements of molecules and atoms in response to its attraction, there is another form of motion constantly going on, without reference to the attraction or impressed motion of the mass. The molecules of all bodies are always in a state of rapid motion, called vibration. In solids this vibration is short, being restrained by the close cohesive position of the molecules. But in liquids, the molecules being further separated, the vibration is far more rapid, and they move around and slide over each other with comparatively little resistance. In gases and vapors the molecules have a splendid field for motion, and consequently vibrate in wide fields and orbits, and dash around with the greatest velocity. The atoms also are believed to vibrate rapidly, in accordance with their own laws of vibration. And the corpuscles are believed to far excel the last two mentioned particles in intensity, rapidity and complexity of their vibrations, as we shall see a little later on in the book. All substance is in constant motion and vibration. There is no rest in substance. Inertia, that property whereby substance may not move unless in response to imparted motion, nor terminate its motion, when it is once imparted, except in response to some other manifestation of impressed force. Science holds that this impressed force or imparted motion must come from without, but the writer holds that force may also be expressed from within, as may be seen by reference to subsequent chapters of this book. Attraction, that property whereby particles or bodies of substance, 1. Draw other particles or bodies toward themselves, or, 2. Move toward other particles or bodies, or, 3. Are mutually drawn together. This property manifests in four forms, generally referred to as separate and distinct from each other, but which the writer believes to be but forms of the same attractive power, and which he believes to be a mental process, at the last analysis, a revolutionary claim, which will be supported by argument in later chapters of the book. These three forms of attraction are known as 1. Gravitation, 2. Cohesion, 3. Adhesion, and 4. Chemical affinity, or chemism. We are invited to consider them briefly, at this point, further investigation being reserved for our chapters on motion and dynamic thought. Gravitation, this term is usually applied to the attraction between masses of substance, such as the Sun, the Earth, and masses of substance on or about the Earth's surface. However, Newton, who discovered the facts of gravitation, states the law, as, every particle of matter in the universe, attracts every other particle, etc. Cohesion, this term is used to indicate the attraction between molecules, by which they are combined into masses or bodies. Cohesion causes the molecules to unite and cling together, thus forming the mass. Adhesion, this term is used to indicate the attraction between masses which causes them to stick together without a cohesion of their molecules. Adhesion operates through the adjacent surfaces of the two masses. It may be considered as a lesser form of cohesion. Chemical affinity, sometimes called chemism or atomic attraction, this term is used to indicate the attraction between the atoms, by which they combine, unite and cling together, forming the molecule. Science has before it the task of naming, and classifying, the attraction between the corpuscles, by which they combine and form the atom. But whatever the name, it will be seen that it represents but another manifestation of attraction. Arising from molecular attraction, or cohesion, are several properties peculiar to masses having molecules, and resulting from the tendency of the latter to resist separation. We had better consider them briefly, in order to understand the power of molecular attraction, and its incidence. Porosity, that property indicating the distances observed by the molecules in their relation to each other, which varies in different kinds of substance. All substance is more or less porous, that is, has more or less space existing between the molecules. The degree depends upon the closeness. Compressibility and expansibility, sometimes mentioned as properties, are but results of porosity. Elasticity, that property whereby bodies resume their original size and form, after having been compressed, expanded or bent. The result is caused by the inclination of the molecules to resume their original positions. What is sometimes called plasticity is merely the reverse of elasticity, and denotes a limited degree of the latter. Hardness, that condition resulting from molecular attraction resisting the forcible entrance and passage of other substance between the molecules. Tenacity, that condition resulting from molecular attraction resisting the forcible pulling asunder, or tearing apart of the mass. This condition sometimes is called toughness. Malleability, that condition resulting from molecular attraction resisting the forcible separation of the mass by pounding, hammering or pressure. The resistance is passive, and consists of the molecules allowing themselves to assume a spread-out formation, rather than to be forced apart. Ductility, that condition resulting from molecular attraction resisting the forcible separation of the mass by a drawing-out process. The resistance is passive, and consists of the molecules allowing themselves to be drawn out into a formation of the shape of wire or thread, rather than to be pulled apart. In any of the above cases, we may intelligently, and with propriety, substitute the words, molecules, by means of cohesion, resisting, etc., for the terms above used, molecular attraction, resisting, etc. All masses of substance, probably molecules as well, are capable of expansion and contraction, both phenomena, in fact, and in degree, resulting from the relation of the molecules. Contraction is a crowding together of the molecules, expansion a getting apart of them. Density, the amount of substance in relation to a given bulk. Volume, the size or bulk of a body of substance. Mass, besides being used to designate a body of substance, composed of two or more molecules, the term mass is used to designate the total quantity of substance in a body. An application of the above terms may be seen in the following illustration. A quart of water occupies a certain space, and has a certain volume, mass and density. Convert the same mass of water into steam, and it expands to a volume of 1,700 times that of water, but, as no molecules have been added, the mass remains the same, but as a quart of steam weighs 1,700 times less than the same volume of water, the density of steam is 1,700 times less than that of water. As the volume of a given mass increases, the density decreases in the same proportion, but the mass remains the same. Mass therefore has two factors, i.e., volume and density. The density of a mass is determined by the weight of a certain volume of it. The above consideration of the properties of substance dealt only with the molecular properties, or physical properties, as they are sometimes called, that is, with properties depending upon the existence of the molecules. When we consider the molecules as being composed of atoms, and when we consider the processes whereby these molecules are built up of, or broken down through the separation of atoms, we come to the subject of atomic properties, or chemical properties, as they are often called. The atomic properties of substance consist principally in the power and manifestation of motion, in the direction of combination, separation, and the complex motions resulting from the same. This motion is manifested by reason of atomic attraction, sometimes called chemical affinity, which we shall consider a little later on in the chapter. Atomic principles, as above mentioned, are best illustrated by a reference to chemical changes, and we shall now examine the same. And, the better way to consider chemical changes is by comparing them with physical changes, or changes of the molecules. Some physical changes in substance are brought about by heat, which tends to separate the molecules, or rather to allow them to spread out away from each other, so long as the high temperature is maintained, the degree of their nearness being influenced by temperature. Other physical changes are produced by outside forces separating the molecules to such an extent, to such a distance, that their cohesive force is lost, and the solid matter is said to be broken, or even reduced to dust. Other physical changes are brought about by electricity, causing the molecules to separate and disintegrate. Chemical changes, as distinguished from physical changes, do not involve or deal with molecules, the action being solely upon the atoms of which the molecules are composed. Physical changes separate molecules from each other, while chemical changes destroy and break up the molecule, so that its identity is forever lost, its atoms thereafter either existing free from combinations, or else recombining with other atoms, and forming new combinations. Chemical changes are occasioned by either physical or chemical agencies. The physical agencies generally employed are heat, electricity, light, pressure, percussion, etc. The principle of chemical changes is that the atoms are possessed of, and subject to, what is called atomic attraction or chemical affinity, which may be defined as an attraction or love existing in varying degrees between atoms. This affinity causes atoms of one element to seek out and ally themselves to atoms of another element, the element of choice or preference being strikingly in evidence. Atoms of different elements form marriages, and cling together in harmony, until, perchance, by some physical or chemical agency, the molecule is brought in sufficiently close connection with another molecule composed of different elemental atoms, when, alas, one of the atoms of our molecule finds that it has a greater affinity for some other elemental atom in the second molecule, and lo! It flies away, leaving its first partner, and seeking the new charmer. Divorce and remarriage is a common thing in the world of atoms. In fact, chemistry is based upon these qualities. Physical and chemical changes gradually transform solid rock to earth or soil. Disintegration, by the action of changes in temperature, rains and atmospheric influences, and other physical changes, have slowly worn down the rocks into dirt, gravel, clay, loam, etc. And decomposition by chemical change that set the atoms free from their combinations has aided in the work. There is no rest in the world of substance. Everything is changing, constantly changing. Old forms give way to new, and these, grown old while being born, are, in turn replaced by still newer. And on, endlessly. Nothing persists but change. and yet nothing is destroyed, although countless forms and shapes have succeeded each other. Substance is always there, undisturbed and unaffected by the varieties of forms it is compelled to undergo. Masses may change, and do change. Molecules may change, and do change. Disintegration and decomposition affect both, and bring to them the death of form. But their substance endures in the atom. Atoms may change, and decompose, or undergo whatever change that is their fate, and still the corpuscles, or what lies beyond the corpuscles will remain. The atom was once regarded as eternal, but now even it seems to be capable of dissolving into some finer division of substance, and perhaps still finer subdivisions await it. That familiar form of substance that we call earth, dirt, soil, etc., is but the result of disintegrated rock, which has crumbled and lost its former form through the action of air, water and atmospheric influences. And the rocks themselves, from which the soil came, were at one time a sea of melted, flowing liquid substance, somewhat resembling volcanic lava. And this melted rock is thought to have been condensed from the same principles in the shape of vapor, that existed in the early days of our planetary system. Vapor, gas, liquid, semi-liquid, solid rock, soil, the substance unchanged, the forms totally unlike. Helmholtz estimates the density of the nebulous vapors of substance as being so rare that it would take several millions of cubic miles of it to weigh a single grain. Oh, nature, what a wizard thou art! We have spoken of air and water, in a former chapter, and their constituent atoms have been named. And from these three great reservoirs of substance, the earth, the air, and the water, are obtained all the material that goes to form the bodies of the animal and vegetable kingdoms. The plant draws its nourishment from the soil, the air, and water, and in its wonderful chemical laboratory is able to transform the elements so drawn from these sources into a substance called plasm, which consists principally of carbon, oxygen, nitrogen and hydrogen, being nearly identical in composition to the white of an egg, and which constitutes the basis of animal and plant bodily structures. All the material of the physical bodies, of men, animals and plants, are but forms of plasm. The animals, and man, obtain their nourishment, directly or indirectly, from the plant body, and so at the last we are seen to draw from the soil, air and water all our bodily nourishment, which we convert into bodily structure, bone, muscle, flesh, blood, veins, tissue, cells, etc. And the chemical atoms of our bodies are identical with those in the rock, the air, the water. And so you see the universality of substance and its countless forms and appearances. Chemistry resolves substance back into about 75 simple substances, of which atoms are the units, which simple substances are called elements. From these elements, by their atoms, all other substances are formed by combinations, the number of such possible combinations being infinite. An element, in order to be an element, must be a simple substance, that is, must be incapable of further analysis into some other elements. The 75 elements, now recognized by science, have never been resolved into other elements, by chemical analysis, and therefore are accepted as simple. But, it is true that other substances that were formerly considered as simple elements were afterward decomposed by electricity, and found to consist of two or more simpler substances or elements. Thus new elements were discovered, and old ones discarded as not elemental. And this fate may be in store for a number of the elements now on the list, and many new ones may be discovered. For a long time science was endeavoring to trace all elements back to hydrogen, the latter being considered the ultimate element, and its atoms composing all the other atoms, under varying conditions, etc. But this theory is now almost abandoned, and science rests on its list of 75 elements, the atoms of which are composed of electrons. Some have hazarded the theory that the elements were all forms of ether, see next chapter, their apparent differences resulting merely from the varying rate of vibration, etc. And, in fact, such theory was about finally adopted as a working hypothesis until the discovery of the corpuscle. Everything in substance now seems to be moving back to the corpuscle, as we shall see a little further on. The following is a list of the principal elements, known to science, today. Aluminum, antimony, arsenic, barium, bismuth, boron, bromine, cadmium, calcium, carbon, chlorine, chromium, cobalt, copper, fluorine, gold, hydrogen, iodine, iron, lead, magnesium, manganese, mercury, nickel, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, platinum, potassium, radium, silicon, silver, sodium, strontium, sulfur, tin, zinc. Of the above, hydrogen is by far the lightest in weight. In fact, it is used as a unit of atomic weight, its weight being marked 1 on the scale: gold, 197, lead, 207, silver, 108, oxygen, 16, nitrogen, 14, iron, 56. The discovery of the corpuscle, or electron, rudely shattered the vortex ring theory of the origin of the atom, and now, instead of the atom being regarded as a vortex ring in that hypothetical, paradoxical absurdity, the ether, it is believed to be composed of a vast number of tiny particles called corpuscles, as we saw stated in our last chapter. These corpuscles seem to be the last thing in substance, its last known state of refinement, and already it is being proclaimed as the long sought for primal matter, or ultimate substance. Whether or not a still finer state of substance will be discovered, science is unable to say, but thinks it unlikely. But we must not overlook the old occult teaching indicating a state of substance so fine that it is imperceptible, and only recognizable as apparently free force, its covering, or vehicle of substance not being evident. This would seem to indicate a still further refinement of substance, although perhaps the corpuscle or electron will answer to fill the bill in the case. As to the corpuscle being primal substance, it must be admitted that its advocates have presented a very strong case. One of their most important points is that although molecules differ very materially from each other, according to their kinds, and while atoms likewise manifest very plainly their kind, the corpuscle seems to possess only one kind, no matter from what form or kind of substance it is thrown off. Just think what this means. It means that the finest particles of gold, silver, iron, hydrogen, oxygen, and all the rest of the elements, are composed of identically the same material, and exhibit no differences in kind. The elements are no longer simple. All substance is one. At the last analysis, the corpuscles seem to possess the same mass, to carry the same charge of electricity, to act precisely the same, irrespective of their source. No difference in size, mass or character, as in the case of the atom. All are identical, save in the rate of their vibration at the time of observation, which is simply a matter of more or less motion. Space seems to be flooded with these tiny particles, these units of substance. They stream from the sun, the stars, and every body highly heated. Likewise they stream from the bodies of highly electrified substance. Groups of these corpuscles, absolutely identical in nature, size, mass, etc., constitute the atoms of the 75 elements, the kind of elements seemingly being dependent upon the number and arrangement of the corpuscles, and possibly by their rate of vibration. Every atom is like a great beehive with a swarm of corpuscles vibrating, moving around each other, and upon their own centers. And, if by the action of intense heat, transmitted, or caused by interrupted motion, or if by a strong electric charge, some of these corpuscles are detached from the atoms, or possibly an atom broken up, they fly off through space at a marvelous speed of many thousand miles an hour. So we see that these wonderful corpuscles look very much like primal matter or ultimate substance, the stuff out of which substance is made. And, taking you back to the chapter on the universality of life and mind, the writer would remind you that in their motions and evident attraction, etc., these corpuscles evidence the same life and mind that we observed in the molecules and atoms. It must be so, for what is in the manufactured article must be in the material of which the article is made. And so, even here, life and mind have not escaped us. Nor will it in the ether. And speaking of the corpuscles, as manufactured articles, we are reminded of Herschel's thought about the atoms, when they were regarded as primal matter and likely to be uniform, and, at the end, of one primal substance. Although Herschel's conception does not now apply to the atoms, it may be transferred to the corpuscles. Herschel thought that the fact that the particles of substance were likely to be found to be uniform in size, and identical in nature and characteristics, indicated that they might be akin to manufactured articles, turned out from the same great machinery of creation. This idea would indicate that the Creator applied the rules of careful manufacture to the manufacture of the particles, the uniformity operating in the direction of 1. Economy of material, 2. Utility through interchangeability, replacing broken or discarded parts, etc., and also, 3. Conformity to a standard of size, quality, etc. The thought is interesting, and is mentioned here for that reason. It is not affected by the supposition that there may be a still finer and rarer form of substance, from which the particles are manufactured. In fact, the idea of Herschel, if closely analyzed, would seem to indicate some such raw material from which the articles were manufactured. Chapter 7. The Paradox of Science. In the days of the ancients, When the philosophers found themselves unable to account for any particular class of phenomena, they bundled it together and referred it to a supposititious something that they called the ether. Finding this an easy way to get rid of vexatious questions, they fell into the custom, and the habit grew upon them. Soon there were a dozen or more different kind of ethers in vogue, each explaining something else, the something else, by the way, being things that science now feels that it understands pretty well. These ethers grew to be like the various vapors of the ancients, a dignified term for we don't know, a respectable road for retreat under the semblance of an advance. These ethers became a scientific scandal, and caused a lax mode of thinking among students of those times. And so they were finally abolished and relegated to the scrap pile of science, where they lay for many centuries until a comparatively recent period, when at least one of them was hauled forth, dusted, freshened up a little, and placed upon its old pedestal. This revamped ether, referred to, was the ether of Aristotle. Aristotle, as we know, was a famous Greek philosopher who lived about 350 B.C., about 2,250 years ago. He was a good man and a celebrated philosopher, but was somewhat deficient in scientific knowledge. Although he knew many things, and uttered many wise thoughts, he was under the impression that the breath of man entered the heart instead of the lungs, that the back part of the skull was empty, and so on. He was without the advantages of a modern training, which was not his fault, however. Well, Aristotle conceived the idea of an universal ether, which he thought pervaded all space, and with which he accounted for the passage of light from the sun and stars, the movements of the planets, and various other physical phenomena. It is not known whether Aristotle really believed in this ether, or whether he merely used it as a speculative hypothesis, following the ether habit of his contemporaries. At any rate, his theory served its purpose, lived, flourished, declined and died, at least seemed to be dead. But its corpse was resurrected in modern times, and used to account for divers things. This does not mean that modern thinkers really believe in the universal ether, they merely assume it as a working hypothesis until something better is offered. Its principle modern uses to account for the transmission of light from the sun and stars to the earth. It was held that a thing could not act where it was not, and so it became necessary to account for the transmission either by the theory that small particles of substance were thrown off from the sun, and traveled to the earth, or else that there was some medium of communication by means of vibrations, etc. Hypothetical ether, Aristotle's own, which waves were carried to the earth, where, meeting substance, they were again transformed into heat and light. It was known that light and heat traveled at the rate of 184,000 miles per second, and therefore the waves of the ether were considered to have that speed. The wave theory seemed to fit the facts of the case better than the Newtonian theory of corpuscles, although the latter has always been considered as better explaining certain phenomena than the new theory. And so the ether wave became generally accepted, and remains so today, although recent discoveries are causing a disturbance in the scientific camp regarding the question. Later it was discovered that the electricity traveled at the same rate as light and heat, and the wave of the ether theory was thus thought to have additional verification, and electricity came under the law and remained there until the electron discovery, which is causing much disturbance among those interested in the study of electricity. Briefly stated, the theory of the universal ether is this: that pervading all space in the universe, not only between planets, stars and suns, but also filling in the cracks between molecules, and atoms as well, there is a subtle substance in and through which the waves of light, heat, electricity and magnetism travel at the rate of 184,000 miles per second. This substance is said to be matter that is not matter. In fact, science does not venture to say just what it is, although it freely states just what some of its properties must be, and, alas, these properties are most contradictory and opposite to each other, as we shall see as we proceed. This universal ether is purely hypothetical. It has been called a necessity of science, something assumed for the purpose of explaining or accounting for certain phenomena. It is undemonstrated and unproved, in fact, may truthfully be said to be undemonstrable and unprovable. Some have gone so far as to say that its claimed properties and qualities render it unthinkable as well. And yet, science finds itself compelled to assume that the ether, or something like it, exists, or else cease speculating about it. It belongs to the realm of pure theory, and yet, many writers treat it as if it were a positively demonstrated and proven fact. Let us examine into the nature of science's problem, and her attempted solution, and the trouble arising therefrom. Light travels at the rate of 184,000 miles a second. Remember, that light and heat are that which we call by those names only when considered in connection with substance. According to the theory, light in the sun's atmosphere is transformed into a light wave of the ether on its travels to the earth, and only when the wave comes in contact with the substance on the Earth's body or atmosphere does it become again transformed into light as we know it. In its travels through space it meets with no substance, and has nothing to turn into light. Consequently space, between worlds, is in a state of absolute darkness. The same is true of heat, and interworld space is absolutely cold, although passing through it are countless heat waves of great intensity, which, later on, will be transformed into heat when they reach the substance, the Earth. The same is true of electricity and magnetism. Although the ether, as we have seen, is a purely theoretical substance, yet science has found it reasonable to conclude that it must be possessed of certain attributes in order to account for certain known facts. Thus, it is said to be frictionless, else the worlds, suns and planets could not pass freely through it, nor could the light and heat waves travel at such a tremendous rate. It also is thought to have something like inertia, because motion once started in it persists until stopped, because it is at a state of rest until motion is imparted to it, and because it takes a fraction of time to impart motion to it. It is thought to be different from substance in any of its known forms, for many reasons, among such being the fact that no known form of substance could carry vibrations through space at the rate of 184,000 miles a second. And light and heat waves travel at that rate, and have forms and shapes, and lengths of their own. Light, for instance, vibrates on two planes, and a light wave is something like a Greek cross, thus, vertical bar, having a horizontal and a vertical line, or plane of vibration. And the ether cannot be a fluid of any degree, because a fluid cannot transmit cross vibrations at all. And it cannot be a solid, because a solid could not stand vibrations at such a terrific speed, and still remain a solid. And yet, to transmit the two-plane light waves, the ether must have a certain degree of rigidity, else the waves could not travel. Lord Kelvin estimated this degree of rigidity as about 19 billionth of the rigidity of the hardest steel. So, you see, science is compelled to assume that the ether is a continuous, frictionless medium, possessing both inertia and rigidity. Some scientists have thought it to be a kind of elastic jelly. Of the ether, Professor Oliver Lodge has said, "We have to try and realize the idea of a perfectly continuous, subtle, incompressible substance, pervading all space, and penetrating between the molecules of ordinary matter, which are embedded in it, and connected to one another by its means. And we must regard it as the one universal medium by which all actions between bodies are carried on. This, then, is its function, to act as the transmitter of motion and energy." To give you an idea of the wonderful thing that science is compelled to think of the ether as being, by reason of the qualities it is compelled to ascribe to it, although it confesses itself unable to imagine the nature of the thing which it has created and bits by the adding and bestowing of qualities which were made necessary by the logical requirements of the case, let us take a hurried view of the thing as the several departments of science say it must be thought of. To meet the requirements of the case, science says that the universal ether must be substance infinitely more rare and evanescent than the finest gas or vapor known to science, even in its rarest condition. It must convey heat in the manner of an infinitely solid body, and yet it must not be a solid. It must be transparent and invisible. It must be frictionless, and yet incompressible. It cannot be a fluid. It cannot have attraction for substance, such as all substance has. Nor can it have weight, that is, it is not subject to gravitation. It is beyond the reach of any known scientific instrument, even of the greatest power, and it refuses to register itself in any way, either to senses or instruments. It cannot be known of itself, but may only be recognized as existent by the things for which it acts as a medium or transmitting agent. It must convey energy and motion, yet it must not take up any part of either from the matter in its midst. It must not absorb any of the heat, light or electricity. It must fill up the spaces between the worlds, as well as the most minute space between the molecules, atoms, and corpuscles, or any other minute particle of substance, either known by name to science now or which may be discovered or imagined later as a necessity of some conception regarding the nature of substance. In short, the universal ether, in order to do the things attributed to it, must be more solid than solids, more vapor-like and gas-like than vapor or gas, more fluid than fluids, infinitely less rigid than steel, and yet infinitely stronger than the strongest steel. It must be a substance having the qualities of a vacuum. It must be continuous and not composed of particles, atoms or molecules. It must be in everything in some respects, and yet a nothing in others. It must not be substance, and yet it must carry substance within its ocean of dimensions, and, besides, interpenetrate the most minute space between the particles of substance. It must not be energy or force, and yet science has been considering energy and force as but interruptions of rest or agitations within, and of, itself. So you see that this mysterious, wonderful universal ether, in order to be at all, must be a something possessing certain qualities or properties of substance, many of the properties of qualities being exactly contradictory and opposed to each other, and yet it cannot be substance as we know it. It is a paradoxical thing. It could only belong to another and an entirely different order of existence from that of substance as we know it. It must possess characteristics and properties of an order as yet unknown to us by name, for which the material world contains no analogy, for which substance has no analogues. It must be a far more complex thing than is even the most complex thing we call matter, or that which we call force or energy. And yet, it has been claimed that it would explain both, yes, contain within itself the possibility of both. And yet, in face of what has just been said, the writer must confess, humbly and with a full realization of the enormity of the offense, that he supposes advancing a theory, a little further on in this book, that will attempt to identify this something, this universal ether, with the something else that we know, although not through the senses or by means of instruments. Bear with him kindly, he begs of you, while he proceeds gradually along the path that leads to the theory. Scientists have compared substance moving through the ether as a coarse sieve moving through water, the latter making room for the passage of the sieve, and then closing up behind it. If this be amended by the idea that the moving sieve, while allowing the water to pass through it freely, still carries along with it a thin film of water which clings to the wires of the sieve by adhesion, if there be admitted this clinging film as well as the body of the water through which the sieve moves, then the illustration answers quite well as a crude illustration of substance in the ether. This fact is important in view of the theory that will be advanced, further on in this book. Professor Lodge, in his interesting work, Modern Views of Electricity, mentions a number of experiments tending to prove the above-mentioned fact, which is not so generally known as other facts relating to the ether. Until the discovery of radiant matter, bringing with it the new theories of the corpuscle or electron, etc., brushed aside into the dust heap many generally accepted scientific theories regarding the nature of substance, the favorite and most popular theory was what was known as the vortex ring theory of the atom. This theory held that the atoms of substance were but vortex rings of the ether, having had motion communicated to them in some way, and which afterwards acquired other motions, and which finally become apparent to our senses as substance. In other words, the atom was supposed to be a vortex ring of ether, acted upon by force, in some unknown way, the character, nature and properties of the atom being determined by the shape and size of the vortex ring, the rate of motion, etc., etc. The new discoveries of science, however, have set aside, at least temporarily, this vortex ring theory, and at present science seems to find its latest thing in substance, in the theory that substance, at the last, seems to be the corpuscle or electron. In other words, after many years of fancied security and a settled theory regarding the nature of substance, science once more finds itself compelled to take up the search for the origin of things. But the theory of the ether remains, and is likely to, although the names applied to it will change. By some it is still believed that in the ether, a little further removed, rests the origin of substance and that the corpuscle may be the vortex ring product, instead of the atom. It will be noticed that science has made no serious attempt to connect the phenomenon of gravitation or attraction with the ether. Gravitation stands alone, an outsider among the forces, responding to none of their laws, needing no time in which to travel, needing no medium like the ether in which to transmit waves, fearing no obstacle or interfering body, but passing right through the same, different. And we shall see why this difference, when we reach the point where our theory brings us to the point where we must substitute something else for the great paradoxical general solvent of modern science, the ether of Aristotle. We shall reach the point after a brief consideration of motion, force, and energy. As we conclude our exploration of dynamic thought by William Walker Atkinson, it is clear that this book remains a cornerstone in the field of personal development and positive thinking. Atkinson has shown us that our thoughts have immense power and that by cultivating dynamic thought, we can truly transform our lives. The principles outlined in this book remind us that we are the creators of our own reality. By adopting a positive mindset, using affirmations, and focusing on our goals, we can overcome obstacles and achieve our most ambitious dreams. By applying the teachings of dynamic thought, we can not only improve our personal well-being but also inspire and uplift those around us. It is a journey toward self-mastery, self-confidence, and the manifestation of our full potential. Thank you for joining us on this adventure through dynamic thought. We hope the ideas and techniques shared by Atkinson continue to motivate and guide you on your path to success. Don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our future daily motivational videos. Keep cultivating dynamic thought and believing in your ability to create an extraordinary life.